What do these things have in common? Bank robbery, idealistic teens, a train station, betrayal. The lead singer and bass player in the first American band to perform in Kazakhstan. Alien abduction. The FBI. Super secret governmental clearances. MJ-12. Assassination. Accusations of espionage. For the answer to this question and more, stay tuned for the next hour. In other words, don't touch that dial. Greetings and welcome to The World According to Pleiades on KFUG Radio in Crescent City, California, 101.1 FM. The 1-hour weekly radio program that covers everything from alternative medicine, hypnosis, meditation, success, human interaction, alien abduction, and the question of, what is reality anyway, to name but a few. Tonight, on The World According to Pleiades, we have a very interesting person, to say the least, Don Deppeller. And rather than going into a long history and explanation of who Don Deppeller is, I would rather that Mr. Deppeller actually, through the course of this interview, help describe that himself. And so the question is, who is Don Deppeller? And, well, Don, thank you very much for being here on The World According to Pleiades. And tell me briefly a little about your background. Now, I understand you were a successful bank robber and self-identified revolutionary. Then years later, you got into trouble with the FBI again when you were charged with being a spy for East Germany. Then, as if that wasn't enough, you worked as a spokesman for Bill Clinton's first presidential campaign. But wait, that's not all. Then you went on to play Kazakhstan, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, as lead singer and bass player with the first American band to perform there. That's a lot in anybody's book. Don, is this all true?
Actually, Pleiades, have to say that it is. There are a couple of slight corrections that I have to make to what you just mentioned. And by the way, thank you for having me on to speak to your audience about these and a few other things. I do want to say that as far as Bill Clinton's first presidential campaign goes, I was only a minor spokesman for Northern Virginia during the Jennifer Flowers period, when practically no elected official wanted to be identified as belonging to his campaign, until, of course, he came in second in New Hampshire and then thereafter became known as the Comeback Kid. But, of course, later on, Bill came to my office after he had been elected president, and on the day that he kicked off his health care reform effort in 1994, and I had a picture of him shaking my hand on that day when he came to speak to a number of small businessmen. And I wouldn't say that necessarily my office, but the company that I was working for. So anyway, getting back to the very beginning, yes, it's true. I was with, in fact, it was the infamous Deppeller Gang that we were known as by some. My brother and I, and the judge's son, and a few others. There were 6 of us, and we had been actually attempting to buy a train station, turn that into a cultural center in the small town up in the Pocono Mountains where I was living at the time. But even before I speak about that, I want to let your audience know it's really Don Depp. As I've become known, although my name is Don Deppeller, and I won't hide behind my moniker of Don Depp, but at the time of the bank robberies, I was simply Don Deppeller, and I was a leader of a small group of people, as I was beginning to tell your audience here, that we felt that we'd been stabbed in the back by City Hall, and we were. we had a number of people working with us on our campaign. We had some investors willing to put up some seed money. We had some theatrical groups and other small groups that were willing to put on shows and other things so that we could use that train station as a kind of a focal place for the town. And this was back in the late 70s when the mall was where everybody went to, and there was no community. Mm-hmm. These days, all of our community is done behind an electronic screen for the most part. Mm-hmm. But at that time, we had been working diligently, playing by the rules, and then they pulled the rug out from under our feet. When I say they, I'm talking about City Hall. First, when it became evident that our little movement was gaining some traction and we were getting some media coverage, the town manager called me in for a meeting, and I thought, oh, this is good. We're going to have some heart-to-heart talks about what our plans were for the station. But no, he didn't want to talk about that. He had a file folder already prepared and a number of exaggerations, some outright lies, like I've been a member of the Communist Party. No, this is not technically true. I was a member of the Young Marxist League when I was a teenager. That's true. Of course, I was still a teenager at the time all of that happened. So he was telling me that if I didn't back off and tell my group not to go through with this, because we were apparently disturbing their cozy little arrangement they had made with another company to purchase that train station mm-hmm. and to turn it into a restaurant. And we had other plans, of course, but at that point, I told him, well, you do what you have to do because I'm going to do what I have to do. And I walked out of that particular meeting. And so what they did is they called a secret meeting before the big public meeting at which this was all going to be debated before the public, because they were probably convinced that by that time, if they had allowed that to go forward, they would lose the battle and probably we would end up making a good case, which we intended to do, and to turn that train station into a cultural center for the town, mm-hmm. not for a bunch of rich New Yorkers to come down and have dinner amongst the hoi polloi.
Okay,
so that was one of my first fights with City Hall, mm-hmm. and we were betrayed. Mm-hmm. Go ahead. You were going to. Oh,
I was just going to say. So you were evil to begin with.
Yeah, that's. I've always been the one to fight the power. I've always been one to ask the next question why. It wasn't because I just wanted to stir things up. Mm-hmm. It really goes back to an attempt to get to the answer as to why things were they were, because I've just never been satisfied with what the explanations that I've been given by authority in any field, no matter what. And of course, that's a good thing when you're going to school, at least to a school where they teach you how to think critically. And I have to credit the high school that I went to, Lancaster Country Day School in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, with instilling that love of learning and that questioning of the authority business. But it was really when we put it to the test, and we had been attempting to purchase that train station, that we found that things didn't work like that. That in the real world, those with power will find any way to maintain that power, and if they feel threatened, they will break the law themselves. And since they usually are the law, there's not very much you can do. Mm. And so my brother had mentioned laughingly, we should just rob banks and paint, screw City Hall on billboards across the country. First, I laughed that off, but as I go on to say on my website, there was more to it than that, of course. But to make a long story short, and it is rather a long story, but we ended up robbing first one bank, and then it cost a lot of money to be on the run. We spent all of that money and tens of thousands of dollars, and then we had to go to another bank. Now, by the time we got to the second bank, we had to steal a toy gun and call a taxi cab to rob that one, and we got away with that. We figured that we were either going to be caught or we were going to be killed, but we couldn't go back, as it were. Mm-hmm. So what I ended up doing as a result is negotiating a surrender for us. Although the judge's son and his girlfriend, who he married later, they went off separately. Their father had been involved in the underworld, so to speak, and he had been able to get them jobs out west as tour guides, and they ended up coming back in out from the cold, and they did their time. We were all basically idealistic teenagers. None of us was over 20 when any of this happened, but you know, that's what ends up happening, and we were very fortunate that we weren't sent up the river for a long period of time, and that as a result of going through the surrender process, we were able to avoid that, and then later on I did receive executive clemency from the governor, which means that I now have my political rights back.
Okay, wow.
Now, that was the story of that's a very short version of the bank robberies, the last bank robberies. First, it was the political party, the last political party that I established in Lancaster, which was a tongue-in-cheek term for Local Association of Sovereign Trust, which was a mockery of the name of the bank. And, of course, we are all sovereign individuals, as conspiracy theorists worldwide will remind everybody. And as sovereign individuals, we have that power ourselves. But that was the original formation, was a political party. And then for the attempt to purchase a train station, it became the last corporation. Again, Local Association of Sovereign Trust. And then finally, the last gang. And by that point, there's no point in registering anything official about it. But that was the last episodes of my life, tongue-in-cheek there. And then after I'd served my time, and we got out, and my brother and I, we went to take a look, and the bank was still there. I mean, rather, the train station was still there, because the ex-mayor, who had been one of our team, of course, before the bank robberies, that is, had made sure that the New York restaurant group was unable to put their plan into action, and even the Chamber of Commerce had phoned me as we were on our way out the door for the first bank robbery to ask me if I would head up a task force on establishing a culture center, because I think they saw the value in that. But to jump ahead to the next moment, it was years later, after I'd been pardoned and come to live in the Washington, D.C. area, that one of my fascinations being Germany and how a city could be divided by ideology, I had written off to both West Germany and East Germany. And the first time I'd done that was while I was serving my time, working as a prison librarian. So years later, I was still fascinated, and I wrote to them again, not to the same addresses, but I was always fascinated by the city of Berlin. And in fact, I went to visit it with my then fiance at the time, right then at the Millennial New Year's. And we arrived there at Tempelhof, Germany, in Berlin, right with, only a few minutes before the New Year's celebration, the New Year's countdown began. We rushed right off to the Brandenburg Gate, and, well, anyway, again, I'm skipping ahead of the story, but the point I was trying to make is that while I had been working in the Washington area, a gentleman had come in who seemed to only speak German. And since the hardware store, the company that I worked for, we sold over the counter to various embassies. Being Washington, all the embassies of the world have an embassy there, so they asked me to come out and help the man, and I did, and I spoke a little German because I tried to teach myself German. It turns out that I was Swiss anyway, but I knew a little bit of German, and so I could speak to him, and it turned out that he was the head of the Stasi for the United States, and had been recently transferred to the United States to his new post. He had not ventured out of the East German embassy after arriving, and when he did, he came directly to my store. And at that time, the FBI, of course, was trailing him because they knew that he was the head of the Stasi, and he would probably be making contact with his agents.
Right.
And who does he go and see but me? And of course, I was oblivious to all this. I had no idea who he was.
Wonderful.
I was simply intrigued enough and interested enough to ask him to try to wangle an invitation from him to take a board game that I had invented to Behind the Iron Curtain. and this was, of course, in 1989.
Huh.
And he was very happy to oblige this young American who he had told nothing of who he was, except that he worked for a German embassy. He didn't even tell me it was the East German embassy at first.
Mm-hmm.
But that he would be happy to accommodate, and he did, in fact, bring an invitation. And since my friends and I had gone to Paris the year before to exhibit our game at the International Toy Fair in Paris, we thought, well, this would be an opportunity to take it behind the Iron Curtain. And with that game, we'd also met with Pink Floyd, and we were guests of the band when they came to Washington to play 4 nights, and they were one of our favorite artists, but they'd also influenced the design of our game.
Mm-hmm.
And Dave Gilmore, the guitarist, thought that it was an honor to have influenced something other than simply music. So we had that little feather in our cap with the game, and as well as the band L.A.S.T. And some of your listeners may remember that band. That was another super group.
Yeah, I would think so.
Tour. And we sat in their limo after one of their shows when they came to town, and their lead singer wrote a song about that meeting, and he allowed us to use that song in our marketing. We were never very successful. It's a very thought-provoking game, but they allowed us to use that song. So that was another great moment in my life, was sitting in their limo, explaining the philosophy of what the game is really about, because it's a philosophy of life. The rule book is a poem. It began as a poem, rather. Mm. And each rule is something of how you play life in an ideal fashion. So anyway, to get back to how that game played a role, well, we wanted to go to the Leipzig trade fair, and that was what the invitation was all about. Well, the East German Stasi agent that had come to the store he wanted us to be able to go to this trade fair, but the only thing that he had come to the United States for come to our store for was to buy a fuse for an electronic multimeter. Mm. Now, it turns out that the electronic multimeter that he was originally trying to buy a fuse for was on a list of forbidden technology, which we had no idea about, because now you can buy it in almost any store. I mean, Walmart, there's not that many other stores in this country.
I'm curious, though, when you say forbidden technology, forbidden by who?
It was forbidden. The United States had a list of technological items. At that time, this multimeter was one of the very first that used the liquid crystal display. Mm. Nowadays, almost everything has an LCD on it. Mm-hmm. I mean, it either has a smartphone interface type where everything is digital and it's full color. Mm. At that time, it was liquid crystal display, which it's that gray color with the black.
Yeah. You know,
letters,
I just have to ask. Forbidden technology. Why would that have been forbidden technology?
I never understood that. Although they came to lecture us, and everybody had to sit through a 2-hour seminar after it was discovered that I was not a spy, but that they would try to recruit idealistic young people. Yeah. And they tried to explain that the United States was on the cutting edge of, technological innovation, and they didn't have this kind of stuff behind the Iron Curtain. Yeah. And if they did, it certainly wasn't in common evidence. I mean, you couldn't walk into a hardware store behind the Iron Curtain and buy a piece of test equipment that had LCDs. Now, I don't know if it was simply just the LCD readout, although I remember that vaguely as being one of the main reasons why this meter was somehow very cutting edge.
Yeah, I think the whole idea of forbidden technology is easily a 3-hour show in itself. No problem there. I just needed to jump in there and ask you that question. So please continue.
Okay. Well, I was simply trying to explain at that time. I mean, that were the circumstances behind the near arrest by myself. Now, what happened is, after the Stasi agent, I'll call him the Stasi agent, although he was head of the Stasi for the United States. But after that episode, when he came into the store and he needed to order a replacement fuse, and I said, okay, I would call him, and then when he came back the second time, he brought an L.A.S.T video club bag, I'll never forget, with not only the invitation, but some propaganda. I'll admit that it was propaganda, because that's, of course, what they try to cast East Germany in a good light and say, come and visit, and this is what we look like, this is what we're about, and, you know, we want to lift up the common man. Of course, this was propaganda, but it had a lot of pictures, and it had a lot of explanations of what they did. It was in English, and I was looking forward to reading up about what life was like, even if it was only through official eyes in East Germany. So he bought the Earl's Video Club bag, and because he was carrying a bag, they thought that he was delivering something, my instructions or whatever it was. And remember, this was at the time that before the fall of the Berlin Wall, which actually was to happen later that year. But at the time, they thought when they were trailing him, these FBI agents would watch these folks come out of the East German and the Russian embassies or any of the communist countries, and they would follow them. Now, the Russian, the guy that would buy tools for the Russian embassy, when he would come in, everybody knew him, and he had an FBI tail that would be following behind him, and it was pretty much understood, but nobody had ever stopped to think, well, the East Germans are communists, so they're probably going to have a tail as well. It just didn't cross our minds that he would have somebody, at least one agent, following him. Nonetheless, it was very innocent on my part, because I was simply interested in going to the Leipzig Trade Fair and taking our Dondep behind the Iron Curtain, as I said. So after the agent left that second time, I guess it was a week or so later, I was actually out sick. Now, it was extremely rare that I took off sick. I was constantly running late, practically every morning, at least 5 or 10 minutes. That was a known factor. But I was very rarely homesick, because I was rarely sick at that time anyway. But that day I really was sick. And so when my boss called me in the middle of the afternoon, I thought, well, is he checking on me? And I answered grumpily, because I had been suffering from a major cold. And I answered the phone, and I started off by, when he said who he was, and I started to say, well, you know that I'm sick at home. I would have come in if I didn't feel that I probably would, it was contagious. And he said, no. He said, I have no problem with that. Obviously you're sick, and that's not why I'm calling. I'm calling because obviously you must have done something much more than you're not just sick. But what is the FBI doing here? They have blocked off your office. There's police tape around it. Nobody can go in. They've taken everything out of the drawers. They're asking all the rest of the guys on the sales floor questions about your habits and so forth. And I said, what? I just shut up straight in bed. I remember that, and he said, yes, you need to talk to the agent, Special Agent Gerlach, and he gave me his card. I believe that was his name. Now, I get my FBI agents confused, because there was one who was in charge of the case investigating us for the bank robberies, and we said, right when we surrendered, before we actually went in to serve our time, we all sat around drinking coffee, and they had tons of questions, because I always stayed a step ahead of the FBI. I knew how to do that. I knew how they would think, and they respected that, even though, of course, their job was to catch us. So we had spent time talking to them, but I confused his name, and I'm not sure it was Special Agent Gerlach was the one who had questioned me on the bank robberies, or if he was the one that had questioned me about the spy situation. Well, I said, well, let me talk to him. He said, no, they've left, but he left his number. He wants to talk to you immediately. So, of course, I called, and the agent answered, and I said who I was, and he started questioning me, and I guess it became evident within a few minutes that I was not working as a spy for East Germany. It was completely blown out of proportion, and as a result, they simply made sure that, they could come in and talk to everybody. They had to do it over a couple of shifts, and they had to go through this long seminar about how communist agents would try to recruit idealistic young people such as myself.
Mm-hmm.
And, of course, they never let me live that one down because you only had to go through that because I had an interest in going to East Germany.
Right.
But that was a story about how I came to almost be arrested as a spy for East Germany.
Making friends wherever you go. I
never met a stranger.
What about March of 2002?
Well, March of 2002 was the day that we first noticed, having just moved into our new house. It was a pretty big house in northeast Washington, but that was when we noticed that there was a white van sitting outside of our new home. Actually, it was not a new house, but it was a rather old neighborhood, but it was new to us, and the engine was always running, and there was always a driver behind the wheel, and it was there night and day, and it only seemed to leave for a couple of hours at a time. Now, there was another car that was also out there at the same time. We called him the Sleeper, and he only showed up at night, and he was parked there too. And we think that it was somebody that just slept in his car because the house was at the corner where we had a little short park, a small park across the street on the one side. Catty corner was the back of a restaurant, which had some trees planted, so it was you couldn't see through the trees. And then across the street on the other side was the back of a Midas Muffler. So we didn't have that many neighbors, so we figured, well, maybe that was one of the reasons why the Sleeper was there. But the white van we couldn't understand, and I assumed that, well, maybe it's some kind of a contractor because they had these long tubes mounted on the top, on the roof of this white van.
Mm-hmm.
It was a late model 2002 GMC, which, as I learned later, is the favored model for white vans government-wide.
Mm.
But we thought there was some kind of a contractor that was always on call, and he was just simply off one of the main drags, which it was right off a block off of Rhode Island Avenue, so this was my first assumption. However, as time went along, we noticed that it was there all the time, and it was during the day, seemed to be the same driver, and how could it be? This was just getting ridiculous, and that's when I was actually doing a lot of digging into the background of this person, who it turns out to be Dan Burisch, the infamous microbiologist who was the personal attending doctor, if you would, to the alien that was housed by the U.S. government from Zeta Reticuli, known as a J-Rod. His personal secret name was Kaela, but he was the one that was kept at Area 51. Technically speaking, it was the S4 facility at Area 51.
Mm.
And the ambassadorial suite that he lived in was attached to a larger chamber called the Clean Sphere. But anyway, again, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. At that time, I had only secured this Q94-109A document, which I'd happened to read on Miss Eagles Disobey website. And out of all of the things that I had seen on the entire internet at that time, which is nowhere near the size that it is today, but it's still, at the time, there was a lot on the internet, and I was looking at that document and looking, and it had the appearance of being very genuine, the first genuine piece of evidence outside of certain Majestic 12 documents that I had come to accept as actually being valid, truthful document, that it was real. So this is around the same time that I started looking into it, but I never really put the two together until I started to post on the forum that was attached to this website where the Q94-109A document was. Most of that website was taken up with pictures and ruminations about what was on the surface of Mars, which, as we now know, were actually true. That there is evidence of ancient civilization there. That would be the Anunnaki culture. Actually, technically speaking, the Anunnaki on Mars were called Ijiji, and Zecharia Sitchin is the foremost authority on this.
Mm-hmm.
However, at the time, this Q94-109A document was more interesting to me because everybody would be talking about Mars and other such things out there, and sightings this and sightings that. And frankly, I wanted to know, well, what are they here for? They must have a relationship with our government, from what little I had read in the Majestic 12 documents.
Now,
well, here was the first document.
Don,
yes.
I just want to jump in for any listeners that might not be aware. Well, first I want to say today we're speaking with Don Depp. And for the listeners who might not be aware, what is Majestic 12?
Majestic 12. Okay. Many listeners are probably familiar with, at least with the term Majestic 12 or MJ12, because it has reared its head in many popular movies, especially ones having to do with aliens and UFOs.
So this is not a fiction.
Was the real organization.
Exactly. This is not a fiction that was just created by Hollywood. You're saying this is actually real.
That it is very much, and I will even give your listeners some interesting insights into some of the quirks and personalities of what this group is all about, because if they really want to look into it, they can go to the majesticdocuments.com website, where Dr. Bob Wood and his son Ryan Wood have done an excellent job of compiling most of the MJ12 documents. Now, among those are a number of very well-executed fakes. That doesn't mean that the organization is fake. It means that there was a very carefully calculated plot to forge documents that are very similar to the real thing, talking about a real organization, so that by the time these documents would be discovered to be forgeries, the audience that would hear about this would say, forgeries, and they would toss the baby out with the bathwater so that nobody would come to believe that such a group as MJ12 actually exists. Well, I'm here to tell them that it does. It is very much a real organization, and it has been real since it was commissioned by President Harry Truman, who at the time of the Roswell crash, and even before, because Roswell was not the first interaction with off-world craft, but at the time, Harry Truman did commission MJ12, Majestic 12, a collection of the 12 most powerful people. At that time, there were mostly military and a scientist or two. I think Vannevar Bush, Donald Menzel was a member of that first MJ12, Admiral Hillenkoetter, who it turns out had also briefed young pilot George H.W. Bush upon his arrival from bombing school at Pearl Harbor in July of 1942, which is another little footnote to the history of MJ12 that is little known by many people. But nonetheless, MJ12 is a very real organization. And here's the important thing when it comes to studying the origin of that group. In the 1947 reorganization of the Department of Defense, which prior to that time had been known as the Department of War, when it became the Department of Defense and the Air Force was established as a formal branch of the military, the CIA was established as the foremost authority on intelligence matters, and various other agencies were established at that same time. Well, during that reorganization of the Department of Defense, think of it as being the abstract establishment of a human hierarchical structure, like a pyramid. The capstone of that pyramid, and this is very important because, of course, this is a Masonic group that we're talking about. All the members of MJ12 have to be Masons. Now, Dan Burisch was inducted temporarily as Chair 9. He was only temporary because he refused to take the Masonic oath. At least this is what he has himself told me. And although he has apparently lied to a number of individuals and lied for various reasons, I don't think in this particular instance he would have had any reason to have lied about that. And aside from that, I have received other forms of documentation that have validated that particular claim. However, back in 1947, when MJ12 was first established, it was done so at the behest of the president, who wanted this group to study and to maintain the secrecy over all issues having to do with UFOs and aliens, because they didn't know what they were up against. They had just won this huge world war, and then they were faced and confronted with craft from another world, and these craft were able to do things that no terrestrial craft could do, and it showed how if we were really under any kind of attack, or if they were truly hostile, they could destroy us. Well, they could certainly outrun, and they could dance around our craft to the point where it just made us look so primitive it left feeling stupid. But at that time, in 1947, MJ-12 was only given that authority. They did not gain and acquire the power and authority that they have gained since that time, to the point where Allen Dulles, in 1963, he having been fired as the director of Central Intelligence, or head of the CIA, the year before by JFK, he went on to carry a vote in the affirmative to have JFK Lancer, that is, assassinated, terminated, because JFK was intending at that time, to release to the public the truth about UFOs, and that he wanted to work in the open, transparently, with the Soviet Union, in front of the entire world, to let them know we're not going to operate in secrecy. There's a lot of information we have. We've been working with so-called friendlies, as they were called. But he did not really understand the depth of the alien issue. JFK, now I'm speaking of. But I jumped ahead from 1947 to 1963 to indicate to your listeners how this group could, even though it was placed at the pinnacle of power at that time, it did not have the actual power such as the president had, because all of the information had to go through the chain of command, and anything that was listed as magic, I think Bill Cooper was about 80% correct on what he had learned during his stint with the military, when he handled documents having to do that were forwarded up the chain of command to Majestic. But irregardless of what those letters in that acronym stand for, MAGIC, as I referred to it, the fact was that anything with that appellation on it, any documentation that said MAG on it, meant that you could not look at it, no matter what was inside of it. Even if you were a general and somebody who was a colonel below you had magic clearance, they could look at it and you could not, under threat of death. You could be put to death if you so much as looked at a document with magic clearance. But the documentation, ultra umbra, is the highest form of classification for all matters concerning the alien reality. Those documents would go up the chain of command to the members of Majestic, and they were 12 men at that time, and they were entrusted with sorting out fact from fiction, determining what the agenda of these aliens was, and to report to the president. Eventually, over time, the president, having plausible deniability, could truthfully say, I don't know what's going on, my people are on it, but I don't know. And that's because the way that Majestic did develop, the vice president is a member of Majestic 12, but not the president. This is how George H.W. Bush could be vice president as he was, and then become president and already know how Majestic 12 worked. So he was an anomaly. Normally, you couldn't do that. Richard Nixon was a member of Majestic 12 because he'd been vice president, which is another little-known thing. But anyway, the point is that MJ-12 grew to acquire all of that power. And my understanding is that while Richard Nixon was president, it was spun off completely to become a privatized board. It was removed from government authority as much as possible, because for the most part, most of these people in the positions of power they tend to be towards the right wing. And with Kennedy's attempt to make everything open to the public and transparent, they're very hard-pressed to allow any Democratic president to know anything substantial about what was really going on with our interaction with aliens. So this group, Majestic 12, was the one that supposedly went into treaty negotiations, negotiated a treaty with the various... Now, there were two factions of aliens. Let me put it this way. Because of our status as soul ranch or soul garden where we're operating as like a laboratory. These treaties really had no effect. They were really for the edification of these powerful poobahs in Majestic 12 who thought that they were the be-all and end-all of power on Earth. And just because they had access, were privy to all the secrets about aliens, and they had an alien in their care stationed at S4, Area 51 area, they thought they were all that, and they certainly weren't. But the aliens had let them think that they had that power. But normally, a treaty could not be signed with aliens or any other terrestrial group, Russians, Chinese, Zeta Reticulans, Pleiadians, unless they have the two-thirds consent of the U.S. Senate. And no alien treaty, to the best of my mind, and I have queried Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid about this, and I do have documents from Harry Reid to Dan Burisch congratulating him on his advancements through his various academic career stages of various degrees that he's received and kudos that he's received from NASA and so forth. But without digressing too much with what I'm trying to convey to the audience about the people behind the scenes that were negotiating, simply put, Majestic 12 had these treaties that they negotiated every 9 years that they signed for on behalf of the human race, in which they supposedly gave permission to the aliens to abduct humans, a certain number of them, and so forth. Now, it's true that the Zeta Reticulans do have to let the human power structure know who they're taking off-world and when they return them. Like checking us out, like a library book when they take us off-world. And Majestic 12 does control that interaction, but these treaties were never validated by the Senate. And for that matter, they didn't even have to be validated at all, because every time that a human was abducted by a Zeta Reticulan, any time that they were abducted with the attempt to, or the goal of taking genetic material from them, it was only done not just with the permission, but with the actual volunteering by the human soul to volunteer their genetic material for the flesh suit that they housed. And I call them flesh suits, not to be cute, but because when you start to think of it in terms of humans being souls piloting flesh suits, then it's easier to understand the origin and destiny of humanity, really. It may sound like a pretty grandiose statement, but that is really the extent of it. So anyway, Majestic 12, they are the gatekeepers, I guess, and they thought they had to give permission to the aliens to take a certain number of us away for abductions, but they don't really need Majestic 12's permission. They did it anyway. In fact, they were taking more for the purposes of taking pregnancies after the third or fourth month, and then those pregnancies would then be relocated to what do you call it, an incubator on several of these alien bases that are stationed around Earth. There's one in the Gobi Desert. There's one big one off of underwater near Catalina Island off of the California coast. And, of course, the largest one of all is between Mars and Jupiter in the asteroid belt. And that particular base, which is one of the major stations for most of the Zetas that are here awaiting the transformation of Earth, is denoted by an egg shape, an egg-looking object on the reverse of the Swiss 10-franc note that was published or printed 1984 to 1999, I believe. That particular series of Swiss 10-franc notes shows that. It also shows the orbit of Nibiru along with the rest of the solar system. And if you ask anybody or that's had anything to do with it, they would say, oh, no, that's just an artistic design, that's all. Well, it's pretty clearly the diagram of the solar system, and it has this strange elliptical orbit, and that is definitely Nibiru.
Now, Don,
anyway, I think I'm advancing a little far afield here.
Don, I'd like
Go
to...
ahead, please interrupt.
Well, one of the things is basically this show won't, in my mind, really be about convincing the convinced, because they're already there. They have a good or a fairly good grasp on some of the things you're talking about. I'm thinking that there are people listening who have steam coming out of their ears right now. Perhaps their eyes are crossing and they're falling over because you've mentioned a lot of stuff. And what could you share at this time that for somebody who is basically clueless, this is like new information for them? Is there anything you could say to talk about documentation behind the things you're saying, so they're not just, thinking, okay, whack job, I'm not going to listen to this is craziness? I mean, what type of documentation can people seek out to research on their own? What is your personal background in researching this information? Please.
Okay. Well, the first document that I would direct them to is the one document that I personally am responsible for securing on behalf of the human race. And yes, I'm proud of the fact that I was able to at least get this. I had authored and had Dan Burisch sign for, on behalf of Majestic 12, the affidavit. It's in two forms. It is in the form of a Form 255. Now, this is very important. This is not some arcane form number. This is a very important number. Form 255, request to admit. It is the same thing as an affidavit entered into a real court case in the Federal Court of Canada. The Form 255 request to admit that I authored, which is at danburisch.info. Unfortunately, there are a number of links that are broken on that website. I'm in the process continually of trying to get those links fixed, but that document is an admission of much of what I'm saying, as far as the fact that MJ12, Majestic 12, does exist, that they do harass people like me that comes into possession of classified data, and that people like Dan Burisch, who was an employee of Majestic 12, even before he became an actual chair of MJ12, he was an employee, and there are about 2,000 of them at any given time, that he did sign that on behalf of Majestic 12 truthfully, and he stood ready to be cross-examined about the full extent of his membership, his role in Majestic and what Majestic's role is. However, very few people could actually believe their eyes. It is an official court document. It is in the Federal Court of Canada. So people can go there and they can read that document, and it will attest to some of the general claims that I am making. Now, aside from that, this is what is important when it comes to documentary evidence. There is such a thing called hiding in plain sight. And the reason that it's important when it comes to how Majestic hides in plain sight is that by these same trees, and some of the terms of these trees, I already addressed the issue about abductions, but some of the terms of these treaties are that Majestic could never disclose on their own, at least, unless everybody, all the power structure of all the major countries on Earth did this at the same time, which is what I ran up against. They're not allowed to tell these things outright to the public because of the panic, because of fear of panic. Not the fear of panic that aliens exist. I think that 9 out of 10 humans could probably live with and would actually be relieved to have the government admit that, yes, aliens exist, and we know about it, and we've been working with them. That in itself would not be a problem. The problem is, why have we not heard about them? Why can we not see photographs of them? There are very few photographs that are real, and they have been allowed to be made real and to be released to the public to see how we react. And those involve the Skinny Bob. That's what they called him, Skinny Bob. If you go to YouTube and you Google Skinny Bob, those videos, and there's a number of them, and they show the same few minutes of footage. They're fragments of videotape in which the survivor of Roswell is shown. He's being measured, and his height, and he's sitting at a typewriter, and he's looking at the camera. That is a real alien. aside from that, the only other real documentary evidence about aliens even existing is that more and more sightings are allowed, although you don't see the definition of craft with portholes and people staring up behind them. We're not there quite yet, but there are a number of alien entities that can be shown on film, but they're not official ones. The only official ones are the ones of Skinny Bob, and they are on YouTube. So let's get it over as far as the documentary evidence. Other documents that have been slipped to the public, such as the Q-94-109A document, and if the listener wants to Google that, they can find copies of that. That was a particular rough draft, which was the first 109A. It was 1994, thus 94. And 109 was the series, and A was the first rough draft. So that is a rough draft or a document that is real. And once you establish the chain of authenticity of one document, it can go down the line to another document. Well, they will simply not admit to it. I have had much correspondence with individuals in Majestic, several of them, and the whole point was, they used to joke about this, that because of the nature of our communication, if anybody approached them and said, Mr. Brzezinski, is this true, they would deny it. And I understand that, and I would have to agree with it, and if I were there in their shoes, I too would say that. And that's important to understand, because the human psyche is very delicately balanced as it is. And when you realize that if some of this information, even just a thimbleful of it, was found to be true, it would cause all kinds of consternation, people's belief systems, and we already know what happens when people go off. They're already on the edge. We have mass murders that can go forward. People just, they can't handle it. Jack Nicholson was right. You don't want to know the truth. You can't handle the truth. There's a lot of truth to that, seriously.
And
so,
and
of
course,
want to look into it.
And of course, a lot of the people that are, well, actually, once you reach a certain level of real awareness, from what I understand, you're locked in, and it's just known that if any kind of a leak is linked back to you, termination is the result. I mean...
Right, national security oath. I don't know if your listeners are familiar with this, but when you begin to go through the clearance process, in order to get a job working where there are certain rape projects, and I spoke about this when I was on William Shatner's show, which was Weird or What? That was a series. I was on episode 7 of season 3. It was aired last year on a few different networks. And I do talk about this, the differences between black projects and gray projects. Now, black projects are the nuclear projects, which they hide the gray projects behind those. But that's because people think that the most important secrets of all have to be nuclear secrets. Thus they're called black projects. Well, Project Preserve Destiny has nothing to do with nuclear secrets. It is a gray project, and it is hidden behind a black project. That's just one example. But anybody that was involved with, say, Project Preserve Destiny would have to sign a national security oath. And what that meant is that they would go to Fort Meade, Maryland, which is right next door to the NSA, and they would go through a 2-week course in which they are shown grisly films of people that had signed their national security oath and then had broken it because, of course, without knowing the full scope of the alien interaction with the human governments or their operatives, like Majestic, those people would be terminated. Well, the first reaction is, well, I have to tell the world this is coming, and blah, blah, blah. And that's a natural reaction, and many felt that. And they tested the one, they tried to go public, and they ended up dead. They were terminated, and that's because there are a number of assassins whose task it was, just like the folks that killed JFK, worked for the CIA and the mob, in some cases simultaneously. I mean, there were so many teams of shooters that day in Dealey Plaza that it was like a regular shopping mall. But anyway, the point is that those were assassins that had that were authorized by the highest level to commit a certain function. In fact, when you sign that security oath, you don't get a copy of it. You're not allowed to even say what is in that document. It's a very official ceremony when you go up to sign it. And you step up onto like a platform, a raised dais, and there's flags and everything, and it's a big ceremony when you sign the document, and that's it. You walk away, and you know that if you ever try to say anything about what you're learning, that you have given, by your signature, the authority to an assassin to come after you and kill you if you even attempt to go and talk to the media about it. And the media is totally controlled, as most people do know. It's controlled, and there's, even if you try to go to the media, unless they want to talk about it, they won't let you talk about it. It's part of their agenda, too. Right. Many of those people are also sworn to secrecy that have to report on these things so they know what they can and cannot say. I hope that that conveys the understanding that a listener might have when it comes to, you know, why doesn't somebody just blow the whistle? Why have we not heard from these whistleblowers? We have heard whistleblowers from what about Snowden? Wasn't he a big whistleblower at all? That's true. But I don't think Snowden, even as much as he knew, he was simply an analyst. And I don't want to say simply, the man is a hero, at least in my book. But the people that had to sign these documents that swore themselves to secrecy, they knew that even if they tried to say anything about it, that they would wind up dead. And in various ways. And in fact, one of the people that who was able to validate for me, I met him at a UFOR book sale. I call it UFOR book sale because the term used amongst Black Ops agents for people that are into UFOs and aliens, they're called derisively UFOs. So I was at this particular, I think it was Fund for UFO Research, and I just happened to be there with a friend of mine. I didn't really haunt these things, but I'd go to one on occasion with a friend of mine. And I was with him, and I chanced upon a couple of tables piled out with books. There was Bruce Maccabee and Kevin Randall, I think. I got into an argument about the existence of MK12, and ironically. And this gentleman overheard, and then as I walked away, he said, you want to get together and talk? There's Denny's across the street. I'd like to talk with you. So I said, well, sure, why not? And my other friend left and went his way, and I went and sat down at Denny's, and I got to know this man. He was an employee of the Department of Energy. Now, because the Department of Energy is intricately involved with some of the great projects when it comes to...
Don, we're all out of time for today, and I sincerely want to thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for having me, Pleiades. We have barely scratched the surface, but perhaps at another time in the near future, we can go to the next chapter. And
yeah, I know we have barely scratched the surface. You are literally a wealth and a world of information. And we'll be talking about when we can get together to schedule our next interview. Don Depp, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to The World According to Pleiades on KFUG Radio in Crescent City, California. If you have any topics you'd like covered, or you feel you have the potential to make a good interviewee, please send your suggestions and or information to KFUG Radio, 270 I Street, Crescent City, California, 95531. Attention, Pleiades. Or email me at radiointerview@moonstar-enterprises.com. That's radiointerview@moonstar-enterprises.com. My name is Pleiades MoonStar, and I love you.